Welcome to Inside Report with Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Bruce Schlesman. With me today, we have a member of the Daily Caller, Vince Coglianese, who's the Editorial Director there and also host of the radio show Mornings on the Mall. Thanks so much for joining us, Vince.
Thanks so much, Bruce.
So today we're talking about the Mueller probe, and I'd just like you to kind of introduce the topic a little bit for us. Like, what's going on with that? If you could just give us some of the footnotes there for the audience.
Well, the Mueller probe itself, I guess, I know I don't have to go this far back for the audience, but I do want to just always emphasize this point. The whole reason it exists appears to be because you had Rod Rosenstein freak out after he had recommended the President of the United States fire James Comey, and in an act of self-preservation decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to launch a special counsel because everyone around me in the Justice Department is wondering why I helped President Trump fire James Comey. So this sort of absolves him of his sins. He gets an opportunity to say, well, no, actually, look, I just appointed a special counsel. And ever since Jeff Sessions, of course, recused himself, the former Attorney General, we've had this thing just steamrolling around without any sort of clear guardrails for the duration of the Trump administration. So with that in mind, there's a whole bunch of mystery around what Robert Mueller has been pursuing, what he's been investigating, and why. This all, of course, started with Russia collusion. But it seems with every passing day, we stray further and further away from any semblance of Russia even being a centerpiece of this investigation. And it's obviously driving a lot of media hysteria. The unknown seems to really charge everybody up in the press.
So there's been a few convictions recently in plea deals and this such. Cohen was the big plea deal that just happened today. What does that even have to do with Russia and collusion? Like, it kind of seems like it's about money and campaign violations and that sort of thing. What does that plea deal have to do with Russian collusion?
Well, to the extent that it even involves the country of Russia, it involves private business transactions that were perfectly legal, it sounds like, for Donald Trump and his business enterprises, considering a Trump Tower in Moscow. Centrally to this was not actually anything to do with the specifics of that deal, but lying to Congress about the date at which any thought about a deal had ended. And it was literally just a few months off that Michael Cohen had told Congress, and that was enough to get him on lying to Congress, which, by the way, if lying to Congress is a meaningful crime, I imagine Congress itself is going to be subjected to a lot of scrutiny, because I'm pretty sure lying within Congress happens quite a bit. I don't know about if you think that, Bruce, but I do. Also, this whole notion for Michael Cohen just of how he's been treated through all of this, whether it be in lying to Congress or how he handled payments to women, this is strayed really far from any notion that it has something to do with Russia collusion, as you so rightfully have pointed out.
Yeah, so it kind of seems like this is centering around alleged affair and paying them off. I mean, what do you make of that whole thing? Like, I mean, they're putting the words Russia in as many sentences as they can related to that, and as you said, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with that. Then why focus on it? Why is the probe allowed to go there?
Well, the key, whether this is Mueller's intention or not, the whole point is to take down Donald Trump, because it's a rejection of President Trump and his legitimacy. So as you've seen through this process, as anybody who's watched this knows, it's moved from Russia collusion to obstruction of justice to, right now, campaign finance violations, which in most cases result in fines, not jail time, but then there's a question of whether or not what Michael Cohen did on behalf of Donald Trump even amounts to a campaign finance violation. The fact that he pleaded guilty means he short-circuited any attempt to put this in front of a court and actually have this tested in front of a jury. He just pled guilty to it, and now we're seeing jail time imposed on Michael Cohen. We have plenty of evidence, though, of a bunch of different players having, encountered this in the past. You have, of course, President Obama, who's guilty of millions of dollars of campaign finance violations, and he was fined a paltry sum by his own Justice Department, which, by the way, worked for that president. It actually worked on his behalf, whereas the current Justice Department, there's some question about that. Also, John Edwards, the former United States Senator, he had a campaign finance violation issue that was very similar, but insofar as he had campaign donors paying to maintain the lifestyle of his mistress, Rielle Hunter. That went to trial, and it ended up with a hung jury. They didn't find him guilty of a campaign finance violation. And in this case, you have President Trump presumably using his own personal funds to pay women to preserve his own image, and all of that is deeply suggestive of the fact that, maybe Congress once again here should be scrutinized for the same behavior, because Congress has a slush fund. It's dedicated to sexual harassment settlements, and if paying people off in an effort to prevent them from going public with their story is a way to help an elected official get reelected, then Congress is guilty of this, and we don't know who is doing it because they keep it secret, and it's with taxpayer money, not with personal funds like is alleged in Donald Trump's case.
Is there any sort of oversight in this? Like, is there a scope of authority? Like, what do we know about the Mueller probe and the rules of engagement here?
Well, we know very little. There was a scope memo that was released, but it was heavily redacted, so we don't actually know the full scope of Bob Mueller's investigation. We do know that Rod Rosenstein has testified before Congress that he's regularly been asked by Bob Mueller whether or not he could pursue different routes. And as far as we can tell, he's never said no to the guy. He continued to expand the realm of where this investigation could go. And that's gone on for a long time, as you know, because Jeff Sessions, up until recently, was the Attorney General and therefore had no oversight over a process that he had recused himself. We've never been given good answers as to why the Justice Department couldn't continue its own investigations into Russia and collusion and all of these questions without a special counsel. There was never any indication that President Trump was actually going to end any of these investigations, even in the conversations James Comey admitted to with the President of the United States. All he asked was that he hoped in the end there would be some leniency for Mike Flynn, but never an order from the President. And again, remember those conversations detailed how James Comey told him 3 times that he personally was not under investigation by the Justice Department. This whole thing has stunk to high heaven from the moment it began.
And we've mentioned Rosenstein, and we mentioned Sessions' recusal, so Rosenstein's obviously overseen most of this probe. Can you tell me a little bit about his conduct and why he wasn't fired when that whole debacle happened in the media where it kind of looked like he was fired and turned out to be a head fake? Would you mind informing us as to what happened there?
Well, then Rosenstein had at one point, according to public reporting, had suggested wearing a wire and invoking the 25th Amendment to take the President of the United States out of office. He has said since then, or people representing him have said since then, that he was merely joking. I've laughed at that because Rosenstein doesn't exactly seem like the type of person that, is always like yucking it up and telling a lot of jokes. Although I have heard from people who've worked with him in the Justice Department that he is kind of a buster. So I'm not actually sure where to fall on that. Here's the point. He has to be transparent with the American people about what his intentions were. And Congress has attempted several times to haul him in for questioning. And each time it seems that he's been able to successfully push Congress off. It's so strange that a Republican Congress can't get a Republican administration's Justice Department official to show up to answer a few questions. But that's what we're left with in a Trump administration where this has become routine.
This stonewalling, it does seem to be routine, and Whitaker was obviously appointed interim Attorney General. Do you think it gets any better with Whitaker at the helm?
Well, there's something interesting going on here. Well, Matt Whitaker comes in, and it's true that he does now have oversight over the Mueller investigation. The White House made that pretty clear, actually, when he came in. Now, whether or not Whitaker is going to sort of get involved in that may be a political question, and he may be looking to avoid the appearance of impropriety at all and trying to see this thing through to its end. Bob Mueller does appear to be winding down. The fact that he actually sent questions to the President of the United States that were answered, or we're beginning to see so many of the players who were involved here in their guilty pleas and in their sentencing. Mike Flynn, remember, his sentencing was delayed over and over and over again, and then we're finally seeing a sentencing recommendation on Mike Flynn from Bob Mueller. Now the question becomes, do Democrats confirm the President of the United States' new nominee for Attorney General, Bill Barr? Because the Vacancies Act, which permits Matt Whitaker to actually hold this position right now as acting Attorney General, has a time limit on how long he can actually do the job, unless the President nominates somebody else to the role. And then that's why Whitaker's going to stay in this job until the United States Senate confirms Bill Barr. So it's up to Democrats at this point. It's up to the United States Senate to basically decide, do they want Matt Whitaker as Attorney General or do they want Bill Barr as Attorney General? Those are their two choices. And I think the president actually, it's something of a masterstroke by sort of forcing them into that corner, saying, go ahead, choose who you want. Because so far they hate Matt Whitaker. At least they hate the idea that he could meddle at all. He could add any constraints at all to the Mueller investigation.
Yeah, they kind of seem really after Whitaker in the media right now. So do you think they choose Barr, and do you think he'd be the better option?
Well, it's hard for me to judge just from my perspective. I've read a lot about these guys. It seems that they're both highly competent at what they do. Whitaker, to the extent that he's even commented on the Mueller investigation, did so in his capacity as a legal analyst. And he seemed to actually be pretty disciplined in his answers. There's nothing crazy or out of control about Matt Whitaker. And Bill Barr, as far as anyone can tell, is the picture of legal stability. A lot of people throughout Washington giving nods of approval, whether or not they like the president of the United States. They think Bill Barr is a very competent man. He's, of course, been Attorney General of the United States before under George H.W. Bush, but he also doesn't suffer fools, and he won't suffer nonsense. So if he comes in as Attorney General and if for whatever reason the Mueller investigation continues, my impression is that he will be the type of guy that says, yeah, there are limits to what you can do as a special counsel. Here are the constraints. Continue your investigation within them. But if you get outside of them, I'll knock you back in. So we'll see.
I mean, that sounds like an inspired choice to me anyway. So let's hope things improve there. With James Comey and his whole thing, the scale and how they were treated between Comey and Flynn is vast. And why do you think Comey seems to be kind of getting away with everything that happened from this Trump administration?
Well, unfortunately, as you've looked at this, Bruce, I've looked at this, and these stories continue. It seems that justice is unevenly applied, depending on whether or not you are associated with the establishment of Washington, D.C. And, President Trump and the people around him are far from establishment figures. Yes, they're super wealthy. That's true. And yes, they've run in powerful circles before. But they are anathema to Washington, D.C.'s politics. Washington protects its own establishment, and James Comey is among them. James Comey has exposed himself not to be some sort of dispassionate purveyor of the law, but instead a hardened partisan with regularity. Ever since his firing, he's been really clear. He supports the Democratic Party. He's very for that. He wants to see it advantaged. He wants to see Democrats elected. He wants to see Donald Trump thrown out of office. And yes, he does have personal animus for the president of the United States. But he also, he started out siding against the president from the moment he met him. He worked for the guy. He began documenting their conversations. There was no indication whatsoever in those conversations that the president was actually committing any acts of wrongdoing, and yet that's how he treated it. And in the end, James Comey pretended, he invented his own standard that all of the documents that he had gathered from those conversations were personal, and he leaked them to the press, and he considers that to this day to somehow be legal and appropriate, despite the contents of those memos being, of course, privileged and involving the words of the president of the United States, and possibly, as far as we have seen, classified. And as a result of all of that, James Comey has created his own standard of government, and you cannot have a country where top officials make up their own rules. They all need to follow the same black letter of the law.
So you're saying Comey, in those conversations with the Comey memos and the whole circus that surrounded them, that there was nothing there, even after all the leaking and probably law breaking, as you mentioned, some of that information was classified and privileged, which doesn't sound very legal to me.
No.
So there's nothing in those memos.
Well, there's nothing in those memos that implicates that the president was guilty of something, because, again, even James Comey himself admits in those very memos that he was constantly telling the president that he was not under investigation. And, the words that we've heard James Comey account, we've only heard Comey's side of this. We've never really we've heard the president account for it, but in terms of giving us a detailed blow-by-blow of what had happened, for the president to say that he hoped that James Comey and the FBI could see their way clear on Mike Flynn was never in any way in order. He never actually ordered James Comey to do anything related to the Flynn investigation. He never stopped the Russia investigation. Has he expressed dissatisfaction about how it got started? Absolutely. And why wouldn't he? The fact that the president of the United States has been very loud and upset about this investigation has been seen by his opponents as some sort of indication that they're nearing the smoke. They can see the smoke. It's the fire. They know they're getting close to taking him down. Well, how about if your political opponent hires an opposition research firm in a foreign country to investigate you using Russian intelligence sources, and then ultimately to inject all of that document, that political document, into the United States government to damage you, and it stimulates an investigation and surveillance of the people in your campaign? Why wouldn't you complain about that? That seems highly reasonable for anybody, including somebody as temperamentally intense as the President of the United States, to complain about.
I'm glad you brought up the Steele dossier. How much of that, the Mueller investigation, is based on that? Because that seems like a big problem.
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, we know that the FISA warrants that were used to surveil American citizens, in this case specifically Mike Flynn, were predicated on, or Carter Page rather, were predicated on use of the Steele dossier as evidence to support them in court. You don't go to the court with that kind of information if you don't need it in the first place to surveil an American. So that was included. We also know now in retrospect that there was some circular reporting that was included. In other words, this very same source, as Christopher Steele himself, the man who wrote the dossier, served as the source for a Yahoo News report by Michael Isikoff, also included in the FISA warrant application with an indication by the government that there was no overlap between the sources in the dossier itself and that Yahoo News article. That wasn't true. This was circular intelligence. It was all from the same source, and it was used to surveil an American citizen. A lot of people have questions to answer, and if the beginnings of this investigation came out of both that and the unmasking led by the Obama White House and the people who had access to intelligence in the Obama administration of Trump officials, just because they were targeting them for political reasons, then this is a deeply flawed investigation whose start very much looks like it had corrupt intent.
It's been speculated widely in the media that the Mueller investigation will be releasing a final report soon. What do you think the chances are of us getting that final report and this entire saga being over?
Well, we deserve that. We deserve closure, because this thing, you talk about the Russians meddling in our elections and seeking to divide us, right? That's what the press has been telling us. Well, what's done that better than this Bob Mueller investigation, predicated on the notion that Russia had successfully in any way meddled in our election and got Donald Trump elected president? Nobody with like a mind and two ears and two eyes, any of the normal things that come along with being biologically human, nobody who is assessing this is saying to themselves, yeah, Russia got Donald Trump elected. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But here's what happened. We have allowed America to become very divided, and it's on the back of these investigations and these things that are seeking to ultimately throw the President of the United States out of office. We have yet to be provided evidence that would justify such an extreme action. Yet the press is fully bought into it, because they've subscribed to a degree of wishful thinking. They don't like the guy, so they read into every dark space of the Mueller investigation. They read the worst possible scenario. And that's a disservice to the American public, and it is only driving us further apart.
Well, thank you so much for this enlightening revelation, Vince, and thank you for joining us on Inside Report.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Inside Report. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, like us on Facebook, and please be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. See you next time.